We've already talked about setting ISO, which is one factor in controlling exposure. The other two core factors in movie mode are your shutter speed and your aperture, much in the same way as you do with photography, with some key differences. Now, your shutter speed in photography can be set at any rate, and apart from looking for a specific effect, i.e. a very slow shutter speed to see motion blur or a very high shutter speed to capture action, there's some subtleties in recording movie which need to be understood. The simple equation for shooting movie is you set your shutter speed at twice your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24p, you'd shoot your shutter speed at 1/48. Now we don't have 1/48 available in the camera, so we set it to the closest near number, which is 1/50. If you're shooting at 25p, then you'd shoot your shutter speed at 1/50. And if you were shooting at 30p, you'd set your shutter speed to 1/60. Now this might seem very, very low to you if you are a photographer. The reason for this is to get persistence of motion and a good motion blur. Anything slower, you tend to get too much lag. Anything too much higher, and you start to get a strange image artifact. Now, all of these things can be rules that can be broken, because if you're looking for a specific effect, a high shutter speed can give you an interesting look. But as a generic rule of thumb, if you set your shutter speed to twice your frame rate, you won't go wrong. So that's your shutter speed. The next thing is your iris. Now the iris controls how much light the lens lets into the sensor, but it also has a massive impact on depth of field. So what happens if you want to have a very shallow depth of field and you're stuck with that 50th of a second shutter speed? Well, you have to control the amount of light coming in the lens by using variable neutral density filters or straight neutral density filters. That's because if you wanted to shoot at f1.4, for example, and have a very shallow depth of field, but there was too much ambient light, well, in stills mode, you'd simply crank the shutter up. But if your shutter's stuck at a 50th of a second, which it has to be, you have to reduce the amount of light in other ways. And the simplest solution for that is the variable neutral density filter. So the variable neutral density filter is a 10-stop adjustment between light and shade. It only affects light intensity and not color or quality. But this enables you to set your aperture at the depth of field you want whilst retaining a fixed shutter speed. So in this scene here, we've got an aperture of f1.4 and our shutter speed is set to 1/50th. Now, of course, the image is way overexposed. If we engage the variable neutral density filter, you can see the scene comes into an acceptable level of exposure and we get the depth of field that we want. Similarly, if we want a deep depth of field, we set our aperture to f16. We need less light to come into the camera, but we still need to control the amount, and therefore we adjust the neutral density filter just enough to get an acceptable level of exposure. The Vari-ND just fits on the end of the lens and rotates at your fingertips. It's a very simple way of controlling exposure, but an absolute essential for this kind of filmmaking. And to control shutter speed, it's much the same way as it works for stills. Simply control it on the front of the camera, set it to 50 and leave it at that. Now the only exception to this rule is if you're shooting at 30p and you'd set it to 60. But 50 or 60 is where you want to leave this, unless you're looking for a very specific effect. Listen, try it out, experiment, but for general filming, that's the best rule of thumb. Let's talk about exposure in video mode. It does differ from that in stills mode. In stills mode, you set your exposure meter depending on how you like to expose, and you use your 0, plus and minus 2 stops in the viewfinder to set your exposure. In video mode, it's slightly different. We use the LCD screen because remember, the mirror locks up. Now you can get a pretty good guide from using the LCD screen, but if your contrast or brightness is set too high in the viewfinder, you're going to get an inaccurate reading. So what we do is, using the info button, click that twice to bring up your histogram. Now the histogram is an electronic guide to exposure, and the easiest way to understand how a histogram works is on the far right of frame is your highlight clip, on the far left of frame is your black clip. What does that actually mean? Well, if we look at this scene here, remember we're shooting at a 50th of a second. If we push the exposure right the way up using the variable neutral density filter, we see a line begin to appear on the far right of frame. What that's telling us is that our highlights are going to blow out and we're going to lose information in the white parts of the scene. So what we're looking to do is push that as far up as we can without clipping the white to get a good exposure. It's the only way to accurately tell if you're clipping your highlights. Equally, on the left of frame, as we push the exposure down, we get to black clip, and black clip is when we lose all the information in the shadow detail. So it's very, very simple. You want to place your exposure in between the black clip and the white clip without losing detail in your highlights and shadows. Now, in some situations, you might choose to let something go. A bright white window, for example, in a scene that's got lots of other depth in it and different exposure levels, you may decide to go, well, actually, it's clipping on the white window frames, but I wouldn't want to see detail in the white paint anyway. So it really is about judging a decent exposure somewhere in between. So that, I would say, let me just start recording there, is perfectly exposed for this scene.